Hi, my name is Lisa Heller-Borgini, and I'll be your instructor for human communication. It's nice to meet you virtually. We're going to be having a series of videos throughout the semester, and we're starting with this one, which is on foundations and contexts of communication. There are several learning objectives. The first is to describe the goals of human communication. The next is to distinguish between interpersonal communication and other forms of communication. We also want to be able to recognize basic elements of communication models. We're going to understand how noise and channels influence communication, and if you don't know what noise and channels are, you soon will. And finally, we're going to recognize basic communication principles. So, first question, what distinguishes human communication? This is a class in human communication, so what does it include? Human communication includes all sorts of communication. It includes the interpersonal communication you might have with family and friends. It includes the one-to-many communication you might have when you're giving a presentation. It includes settings where you're in small groups, where you're working with 3 or 4 other people, or in large groups. So human communication encompasses lots of different contexts and arena and the types of communication you're going to have. In this class, we'll learn principles to understand how to better communicate in all of those settings. The first thing we want to do is to look at a couple models that can help us understand how communication works. The first model is the linear model. This is a pretty simple model. It's the traditional one-to-many communication model where communication flows in one direction from the sender to the receivers. You can kind of see that this is a model that was made that really applies best to public speaking settings because you have the sender who has all this knowledge and they imbibe or send off this message to receivers who are like sitting there like, you know, sponges waiting to just soak up all the knowledge of the sender. The sender will encode this message and transmit it out. How do we encode a message? Well, you're encoding a message when you have thoughts and ideas that then you translate into language that comes out of your mouth or gestures or expressions on your face. We communicate and we encode the message in different ways based on the setting and the audience. So when we're in the communication model, the thing that we want to think about in any model, including the linear model, is we want to think about the channel. So Marshall McLuhan was a media scholar who often was known for this very famous phrase, the medium is the message. And what he meant by that was that the way we communicate influences what we communicate and how people receive the message. And that really is referring to this concept of a channel. You may be familiar with the word channel from flipping the channel, changing the channel on TV. That can help you understand what a channel is because different channels might cover the same information in different ways, right? If you look at a news program on Fox News versus CNN, the material is going to be covered very differently. So a channel influences the message, and it's not just based on bias or objectivity or any of that. It can actually be based on constraints of the channel. So a channel isn't just a TV channel. It can be something like you are on the phone. That's channel. You're face-to-face. That's a different channel. We might have the same message, but if you're on the phone, that message will be received differently than if you're communicating it face-to-face. Likewise, texting, that's a channel, and that will influence the message as well. So there are 3 qualities that influence channels: channel richness, channel immediacy, and channel synchronicity. Channel richness says how deep or how many numbers of channels we can send a message, like in a particular channel, how much information can get transmitted through. The channel immediacy refers to how much attention and how quickly that information can get out. And the channel synchronicity is this information going to be responded to in real time, or do we have a lag and a delay? Face-to-face communication allows for the greatest channel richness. And what does this mean? That means that you can see, touch, taste, smell, hear the message. So you have lots of channels within that face-to-face communication. Face-to-face communication, therefore, has more information, and it tends to have less miscommunication, right? If you text someone a message, you don't always get all the information. You might have some misunderstanding because nuances like expressions and tone of voice aren't things you can translate very well in a text. You can try with smiley faces or, emoticons and that sort of thing, but it's hard. So face-to-face communication requires greater attention, right? Than it if you were on a Zoom call, or if you're in a texting. You could kind of put a text aside, do something else, come back, read the message, and respond. You can't do that in a face-to-face setting. So face-to-face happens in real time. It's the most synchronous. It happens right away, and it requires the greatest attention, but you have the most information. So it's the most richness out of any type of communication. Video chatting allows for greater channel richness than the spoken or written word. It's almost as synchronous as face-to-face. The drawback versus face-to-face is that not all nonverbal cues can be picked up on. We don't actually get nuances like micro expressions, or tone of voice is harder to analyze. We only see part of people's frame, whatever happens to be in the video frame. And off-screen actions can limit immediacy. People might be distracted by the dog barking, or the kid like breaking a glass, or something that's happening, so it can be less immediacy. Phone conversations have moderate channel richness. The spoken words and tone of voice, you can hear the quality of the voice, but you can't see what they're doing, right? Here's a picture of somebody who's like painting their nails while they're on the phone. It's relatively synchronous, meaning you have more or less immediate response, but it's a lower level of immediacy. One of the least channel-rich mediums is texting, where you rely basically only on the written word, and that's true for email as well. That's because you don't have tone of voice, you don't have expressions, you don't have any of that. And so text messages are moderately synchronous. Email messages are less synchronous. What does that mean? That means that people are going to maybe only check their email once a day, so you won't necessarily hear back from them right away. And the same thing with text messages. They might be texting and then going to do something else and not have their phone with them. And text messages convey immediacy because you get the immediate notification, but they don't always create immediacy. So it's very interesting because people will often feel slighted if you don't respond to their text right away. But that is something that we probably should work on, because you don't always have access, and having your phone on you 24/7 is not a healthy way to live. Notes, letters, and the written word have the least channel-rich form of messaging. They're considered asynchronous because you don't know when a letter is going to arrive. You don't know when somebody's going to read your note. But they're interesting because they're the most likely to inspire sentimental attachment. So people feel very connected to the written word in a letter. So back to this linear model of communication. The linear model is very clearly sender to receiver. It does affect things like channel. It does think about encoding, but there's a couple more qualities we want to look at here in this chart. Because in addition to encoding, which is how the sender kind of sends out the message to the receiver then will decode that message. And how the receiver decodes that message depends on how much the receiver was paying attention, how much they understood. So we don't actually know, we can't predict 100% that what the sender sent is what the receiver will receive. What the sender encodes isn't always what the receiver decodes. And there's several reasons for this. One is the channel, right? We already talked about that. But another quality that makes a difference on whether or not the receiver has accurately gotten the sender's message is a concept called noise. Noise is anything that interferes with communication, and there's lots of different types of noise. There's the type of noise that is literally noise, like we can hear something going on in the background, right? And that is clearly something that might cause some noise and distractions. But physical noise is by no means the only way that people have distractions. You might have psychological noise, like you might be distracted by something that's going on in your brain, like I'm nervous or I'm anxious or I've got this big job I've got to get done. All of those things can create noise that makes it hard for you to pay attention to the message. Physiological noise happens when you might be having something physically going on with you. You've got stomach issues, or you're fighting an illness, or you have a hearing issue, or you've got an ear infection. All of those things might create noise that you can't pay attention to the message. You might also be physiologically distracted by the smell in the room. If it smells horrible, you can't pay attention, or it's super, super hot in the room. Those are physiological things that affect the message. And then finally, we have to consider the influence of semantic noise. And semantic noise is where the word or the expression has hidden meaning or has baggage. Like there's something about that word that makes you blanch and you can't pay attention, right? So for some people that's swearing. If somebody swore, if a 5-year-old swore at me, I'd probably not paying attention at all what they said. It'd go, a 5-year-old just swore at me, right? Or it could be that there's a racist word or a sexist word or sexist expression that might affect you. Semantic meaning can also be a difficult noise when it's a language that's not your first language. So if you're not English is a second language for you, or if you're in a country where you're talking with somebody and they're speaking a different language and you don't quite understand the meaning of what they're saying. So, for example, the expression, cut the cheese. If you are not a native speaker, you won't know that that expression actually means something other than cutting the cheese. It's an allusion to flatulence, right? And so I have a story a student told me who's Brazilian, didn't know this expression, cut the cheese, was buying a bunch of cheese, brought it to the store, was checking it out at the supermarket, and the cashier said, "Oh, you're going to cut the cheese tonight, huh?" And the student goes, yeah, I'm going to cut all this cheese tonight. Totally lost the meaning, did not get it because of that semantic noise. So as we discussed, the linear model has its drawbacks because it's only like the speaker to the sender and there's no feedback. There's no two-way communication. So the transactional model was created to kind of address that. The transactional model explains and looks at communication as a two-way communication. The speaker might talk to the people and the people might speak back. And this applies not just to one-to-many situations like the one we're seeing here. It can be in a one-to-one situation. You have feedback back and forth between two people having a conversation. That's a two-way communication, and that's the transactional model. It really emphasizes the relationship between the speakers and the senders and how that will impact the message. And in the transactional model communication, you see it's looking like it also talks about the channel of feedback will impact the message. So if you looked at the linear model, it didn't really look at having a channel of feedback. This one does. So people might have feedback channels, for example, in a newspaper or online, in a blog or online in a YouTube video. People might make comments on the video or make comments on the blog. That's feedback. That is the channel of feedback, and that is going to be received or not by the sender in a way differently than how the sender's message got received by the receiver, right? And all of that is still influenced by noise, and we have this field of experience which will influence how the sender and receiver process that information. There's a really interesting kind of chart that you can go through, and you can look at how you are motivated to communicate interpersonally. And we're not going to do this. If you're interested in doing it on your own, I encourage you to look it up, interpersonal communication motive scale. You can go look it up on Google and see if you can find it and rate yourself. But it basically, if you look at all these statements, they're looking at how you are motivated to communicate, and it can tell a little bit about you and your communication style in an interpersonal setting. So I talk to my relational partner because I enjoy it. You can strongly disagree to strongly agree. I talk to my relational partner to unwind, and all of these different qualities will then be rated, and you get scores. And it'll tell you a little bit about how you are likely to demonstrate affection to your partner and how your partner and why you're in a relationship with people. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, I encourage you to look it up. And if you can't find it, let me know and I'll be happy to share it with you. It's kind of a fun self-assessment tool. We will be doing a self-assessment tool in here called the Myers-Briggs Personality Profile, and I'll be happy to share that with you on our learning management system. So the last thing I want to cover in this video is 5 foundational principles about communication. The first one is you cannot not communicate. This means that we they think, oh, I'm not communicating with that person, I'm going to stop talking to them. You're communicating something by not communicating. Okay? People ascribe meaning to communication, but they also ascribe meaning to unintentional messages. So you may not intend to say something. By not saying something, you're saying something. And motivations for communication, intentional and unintentional, are varied. But either way, you're still communicating something. Foundational principle 2. Interpersonal messages follow rules. We have rules and norms and expectations to our communication that are based on culture, they're based on context, and personal experiences. And all of these rules may be written or unwritten. We may not actually know that we're breaking a rule if we're not familiar with a particular culture. We may not be aware that based on personal experiences, you have set up a rule that somebody else may not. So we break rules, but they're still there, and we need to be aware of them. Foundational principle 3, communication contains both substance and nuance. What this means is that we have messages that are both content, the actual meat of the matter, and relational, which relates basically to the people who are communicating. It isn't just the actual message that matters. It's who we're sending that message to. You're not going to communicate with your bestie the same way you are with your invalid grandmother, right? The content may be the same. Maybe you're saying, I'd like to go to, this sports arena on Saturday. But the relational information, how we communicate that to these different people, may be very different, right? Maybe you're talking to your uncle who's a big sports nut, and you're like talking about the game. You're going to talk very differently about the game with your uncle who's a sports nut than you are with your girlfriend or boyfriend who doesn't care about sports at all. Foundational principle 4, you cannot take back communication. We might put our foot in our mouth. Unfortunately, we can't undo it. We can say we're sorry, we can ask for forgiveness, but you can't ignore it. It's there, it's done, it's happened. Verbal and nonverbal messages cannot be taken back once they're processed, and messages can then change the course of a relational experience. So it's important to consider the impact that communication has. And finally, communication varies widely. What we mean isn't always what we say or how people perceive what we've said. It's basically, communication is an away game, is another way of saying this. Meaning that we don't know what's going on in somebody else's head. Just like if we're a sports team, we don't know what the other person's field is like until we're there. We don't know what the field conditions are in somebody else's head. Meanings might change over time. Culture, context, and relationships affect this interpretation, and we have to be ready and flexible because we don't know what's going to happen. It's a changing landscape in communication. Thank you very much. I'm very glad you're in the class. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to meeting you virtually online. And all the best.